we go ahead and get started? I believe everybody here is familiar with Dr. Samuel Kahn at this point, so why don't you take it away?
Great. So my name is Samuel Kahn, and the title of my talk today is Positive Duties, Maxim Realism, and the Deliberative Field. This is the outline of the talk. I'm going to begin with the introduction. I'm going to try to explain what my thesis is in some detail. And we're going to move on to the first main argumentative section of the talk. I'm going to be talking about Maxim Realism, and what I'm going to call the standard account that I'm going to be attacking. And we'll move on to the second main argumentative section of the talk, where I'll be talking about Maxim Contraries and the Deliberative Field. And then I'll try to wrap things up fairly quickly in the conclusion. I'm going to come back to this slide a few times through the talk. It's going to be sort of like an anchor slide, in the hopes that if anybody gets lost during the argument or sort of like, what's he talking about now? You'll have a good idea when this slide comes back up. Oh, he's putting something down now, and now he's picking up the new thing. But hopefully that won't happen. Okay, so let's begin with my thesis. My thesis is that it's not the case that positive duties can be derived from Kant's so-called universalizability tests. What I want to do now, in the introductory part of this talk, is go through each of the bits of jargon in this thesis and explain in some detail what they are, contrast them with other pieces of jargon that they might be confused with, in the hopes of trying to make clear exactly what I'm going to be arguing for and trying to do in this talk. So let's start with positive duties. The technical definition of positive duties can be given either in terms of obligatoriness or in terms of impermissibility. So an agent has a positive duty if, but only if, it would be impermissible for that agent to omit some particular action A or not to adopt some maxim M. Okay. Where a maxim is just a principle of action. And I'm going to say more about that later. Equivalently, we could say an agent has a positive duty if, but only if it would be obligatory for an agent to perform some particular action A or adopt some particular maxim M. Now, the contrast class for positive duties is the class of negative duties. An agent has a negative duty if, but only if it would be impermissible for an agent to perform some action A or to adopt some maxim M. Or equivalently, an agent has a negative duty if, but only if it would be obligatory for an agent not to adopt some maxim M or not to perform some action A. Okay, so that's sort of the technical stuff. Here's an example to make this a little more concrete. Consider the maxim to tell a lying promise, sometimes to tell a lying promise. If that maxim is impermissible, then we would say agents have a negative duty, namely not to adopt that maxim, sometimes to tell a lying promise. If the maxim sometimes to help others is obligatory, then agents have a positive duty, namely the duty to adopt the maxim sometimes to help others. We can point at a maxim and say, if an agent has not adopted that maxim, then she or he has done something wrong. Now, there are all sorts of other concepts that are brought up here, other ways of carving up the moral landscape, especially in Kantian ethics, which is what this is about. Concepts like perfect duties and imperfect duties, strict duties versus meritorious duties, narrow duties versus broad duties. And commentators spend a lot of time arguing about how it is that Kant uses these distinctions, arguing sometimes that these distinctions are coextensive with the positive-negative duty distinction. I'm not going to be saying anything about that here. I'm also not going to be arguing anything about negative duties. I'm just going to be arguing about positive duties, and in particular that positive duties cannot be derived from the so-called universalizability tests. Okay. So what are the universalizability tests? That's sort of the second big piece of jargon here. Well, there are two of them. There are two universalizability tests, and these are formulations of the so-called categorical imperative, which is Kant's version of the supreme law of morality, at least as it is articulated for imperfectly rational beings like us. The universalizability tests, the first one, the formula of universal law, acronym FUL, introduced first in part 1 of the Groundwork for Metaphysics of Morals and then again in part 2. It's at the top of the screen here. Act only according to that maxim by which you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law. That's the first universalizability test. The second one, so-called formula of a law of nature. Kant introduces this in part 2 of the groundwork. And it's right up here at the bottom of the screen. Act as if the maximum of your action should, through your will, become a universal law of nature. The main difference between these two formulations seems to be in the kind of law that we're talking about. The first one, the formula of universal law, seems to be talking about universal laws, where for Kant, a universal law is one that all perfectly rational agents would follow without exception. We're not perfectly rational agents, of course, but perfectly rational agents would do this. Formula of the law of nature is talking about laws of nature, which, on Kant's account, are deterministic, causal laws that all agents would follow, again, without exception, insofar as they are parts of a system of nature. Now, there are all sorts of deep questions that arise here, fraught questions that arise here, about, for example, whether these two formulations are equivalent, in the sense that they pick out the same maxims as permissible and impermissible. Questions about how it is that we should interpret what it means to be able to will a maxim at the same time as a universal law or as a law of nature, whether that's a practical contradiction or a logical contradiction or a teleological something or other, maybe teleological contradiction. There are questions about how these tests relate to other formulations of the categorical imperative that Kant introduces in the groundwork for metaphysics of morals, primarily the formula of humanity, the formula of autonomy, the formula of a realm of ends. And again, I'm not going to be getting into any of those questions. Those questions are really complicated, and I'm not going to have anything to say about those in this talk. For my purposes, it suffices to note that these are tests of maxims. One, these are tests of maxims. And two, they are first and foremost tests of the permissibility of maxims. Charitably interpreted, these seem to give us necessary and sufficient conditions that a maxim must meet in order for that maxim to count as permissible. They pick out negative duties. And we need some further tool, some further machinery, some further argument in order to get us toward positive duties. And my thesis is that there isn't anything that really can do that work. There's nothing that can do that job. Okay. So the last piece of jargon up here can be derived. What do I mean when I'm saying that? Well, I'm not trying to say that the universalizability tests are supposed to be formal decision procedures and, hey, look, if somebody were to make up some computer program like Fitch or something like that, that you can't go in there and write up a formal derivation of positive duties from these tests. I'm not saying that because I actually don't think that the universalizability tests are formal decision procedures. I think at best they give us sort of informal decision procedures. Judgment is not eliminated at any step of the process. I'm not arguing, for example, that in order to determine whether a maxim is obligatory, there's a positive duty, you'd have to test infinitely many maxims. There's no fixed enumeration of maxims. Therefore, it's impossible to derive a positive duty. I'm not arguing that even if there were a fixed enumeration of maxims, no human ever will be in a position to test infinitely many maxims. Therefore, no human ever will be in a position to derive a positive duty. What I'm arguing is that even if there were a fixed enumeration of maxims, even if humans were in a position to test infinitely many maxims, still, if the universalizability tests were our only standards of ethics, there wouldn't be any positive duties that we could derive from them, because there wouldn't be any positive duties, because in any given situation, for any given action, there always would be more than one permissible maxim that an agent could adopt. So I want to say two last things about my thesis before I move into the argument for it. First thing I want to say is that this is very much not an exegetical thesis. This is a thesis in Kantian ethics, not a thesis in Kant's ethics. At no point in this talk will I be saying something like, hey, look, the standard account says, here's how you derive positive duties from these tests. And then if we look at Kant, and we go through his texts really carefully, we see not only does he never make that argument, but actually he positively eschews it. So this argument isn't textually warranted. At no point will I be saying anything like that. This is a point about the philosophical plausibility of the endeavor of deriving positive duties from the universalizability tests plausibly construed. I'm also not going to be arguing that positive duties are necessary for any plausible system of ethics, and therefore this is a problem for the universalizability tests. I'm also not going to be arguing that positive duties are entirely superfluous, and that there is some deep truth illustrated about positive duties by virtue of the fact that we can't derive them from the universalizability test because these are all that we need for ethics. I'm not going to be taking a stand on any of those really big questions. Again, my thesis is the hopefully somewhat smaller project of trying to show that no positive duties can be derived from the universalizability tests. And what can be shown after that is a project for another day. Okay. So hopefully you guys have a pretty good idea now of what I'm going to be trying to do in this talk. Let's move into the first main argument section. So Maxim Realism, this is another bit of jargon that I haven't explained yet, but hopefully it'll become clear as we're going through this section of the talk. This section is going to have three main parts. I'm going to begin by going through a few quotations from commentators, Kantian ethicists, and Kant scholars who attempt to derive positive duties from the universalizability tests. After I go through those quotations, I'm going to explain their argument in my own words. And then after I've done that, I'm going to explain why I think this argument doesn't withstand critical scrutiny. And there's going to be a sort of like, here's my objection, here's how somebody might reply, here's an objection, here's why I think that reply doesn't work, here's how they might reply again, and so on. Okay, so let's get started. So we've got three quotations up here. I'm just going to read them out. And then, again, I'll explain them in my own words. The first one, this is from Paul Guyer, very prominent Kant scholar and Kantian ethicist. It says, just as the falsity of one statement implies the truth of its contradictory, for example, it is false that it is raining today implies it is true that it is not raining today, so it would seem that the impermissibility of adopting one maxim does imply the necessity of adopting its contradictory. Thus, the impermissibility of the maxim of never helping anyone does imply the necessity of the maxim of helping someone sometime. We get almost the same exact message in the second quotation here, which is from Herman, another very prominent, very well-respected Kantian ethicist and Kant scholar. If the CI procedure, which is what she refers to as her interpretation of how the universalizability tests are supposed to work, if this procedure shows that it is impermissible to adopt the maxim to never help anyone, it follows that we must adopt its contradictory to help some others sometimes. And then this third quotation, which is from Harrelson, a prominent article that was from a generation ago, he argues that Kant holds A, that a maxim is not morally acceptable and must not be adopted if it cannot be universalized. B, that it may be adopted if it can be universalized. He may also have thought C, that a maxim must be adopted, ought to be adopted. What I shall loosely call its contradictory is not universalifiable. C would follow from A together with the additional premise, which I see no reason to cavil about, that if it is our duty not to do A, then it is our duty to do non-A. Okay. Now in the paper that I submitted for this talk, I have a whole slew of other quotations, both in the main text of this part of the paper and in the footnotes, in which I try to give evidence for the fact that I'm going to call this, or to make plausible the idea that I'm going to call this sort of the standard account out there. For now, I'm just going to ask that you take my word for that. What I'm going to try to do now is explain how this argument works in my own words. The first thing to note is that in all three of those quotations, they make appeal to something called maxim contradictories. So what's a maxim contradictory? Well, two predicates are contradictories if but only if nothing instantiates both and everything instantiates at least one. Example of this that's often given, live and lifeless. Everything is either alive or lifeless. Nothing is both at the same time anyway. If we're talking about maxim contradictories, it's just an extension of this idea. Two maxim are contradictories if but only if all agents have at least one of them and no agent has both. And the intuitive pull behind the notion of maxim contradictories can be gotten on board by means of the following kind of thought experiment. Given any general action description A, we can ask whether an agent ever would perform that action. Would so-and-so ever perform that action? If yes, then she or he has the maxim sometimes to A, and if not, then she or he has the maxim never to A. Really simple, right? Just take a general action description, append on the one side sometimes, append on the other side never, and you get two maxim contradictories. Right? All agents have at least one, no agent has more than one. Now, if we're armed with the notion of a maxim contradictory, it's actually really easy to derive positive duties from the universalizability tests. We take the universalizability tests to provide us with criteria of permissibility. We say, if a maxim is universalizable and its contradictory is not, then it seems to follow immediately that the original maxim is a positive duty. We have a positive duty to adopt that maxim. So let's try to explain this in a little more detail, try to make it a little more concrete with the example that was used by both Geyer and Herman. So suppose our maxim contradictories are sometimes to help others and never to help others. Okay? Without getting into the details of how the universalizability test, let's just assume, for the sake of argument, take on board from these other commentators that sometimes to help others is universalizable and never to help others is not. What follows from that? Seems to follow from that that sometimes to help others is a permissible maxim and never to help others is not a permissible maxim. Well, what do we get then? Well, if these are maxim contradictories, then all agents adopt at least one. Well, if you've only got two options, one of them is impermissible and the other one's permissible, the permissible one is eo ipso obligatory. You got a positive duty. Positive duty to adopt the maxim, sometimes to help others. And that's the basic idea behind this argument. Right? Okay. So now I'm going to try to explain why I think this argument doesn't work. The basic problem that I think this account faces is that it presupposes an objectionable form of maxim realism. And in order to explain why I think that's so, I want to begin by focusing on the process of maxim acquisition. So in Kantian ethics, the concept of a person it's a vague concept. At 0, we're not persons. At age 35, if we're normal, functioning adult human beings, we are persons. Now, the question of when personhood begins for Kant's ethics, the exegetical question, is a vexed question. I'm not going to really take a stand on that now, but if you're curious, I do make some points about this in the paper, and I'd be happy to say something about it during the Q&A. But for now, hopefully it will suffice to say that for Kantian ethics, the notion of a person certainly does not begin at age 0. Somewhere between 0 and 35, humans start being persons. And what does that mean? Well, that means that at some point in that time period, we go from not, properly speaking, having the psychological machinery to have a maxim, properly speaking, to having at least one of each maxim contradictory pair. But if maxim contradictory pairs are formed just by taking a general action description and appending sometimes to it on the other side and never to it on the other side, well, presumably there are infinitely many action descriptions, general action descriptions. So presumably there are infinitely many maxim contradictory pairs, once it seems to follow that sometime during this period, agents go from having really 0 maxims, to having infinitely many maxims. And this, I think, is somewhat counterintuitive. Well, why do I think this is counterintuitive? We can tease that out by focusing on a way in which somebody, a proponent of the standard account, might object to this. They might say something like the following. Well, look, yes, this transition does take place, but it doesn't take place in a day. It's not like that, right? It's not like the legal concept of personhood. It's not like you wake up on your 18th birthday and all of a sudden, boom, you're a person. It's a gradual process. It's a gradual process. Moreover, agents are able to react to infinitely many stimuli. Agents can form infinitely many sentences. Agents have a concept of the infinity, of the infinite. Why not just say that agents have infinitely many maxims? What's so implausible about that? They acquire them over a long period of time. What's wrong with that? The problem with that, I think, is in what we take maxims to be, what maxims are supposed to be, namely subjectively normative principles of action. Maxims are rules by which an agent governs him or herself. And so if we're committed to this idea about maxim contradictories, then we're committed to saying not only that upon reaching agenthood, these humans acquire all sorts of maxims about which they will, in fact, have rules to govern themselves by, namely maxims about when to turn homework in, maxims about how to treat friends, maxims about how to treat family, maxims about how they want to live their lives, and so on and so forth. In addition to that, they're going to acquire all sorts of maxims about things that they never in a million years will have contemplated. Maxims like sometimes to bake others or never to bake others, right? Those are presumably maxim contradictories, so by virtue of reaching agenthood, an agent will have to have at least one of those. Maybe a maxim like never to fillet others, never to skin others, never to practice botulism. Maxims that it would be inappropriate to mention in the context of an academic talk, maxims that it would be inappropriate to mention outside of the context of an academic talk. If maxims are supposed to be subjectively normative principles of actions, rules whereby an agent governs him or herself, then it seems a little odd to say that agents are acquiring maxims that they never would use to govern themselves. Now, one way in which proponents of the standard account might object here is to say something like, well, yeah, you're onto something right here. Maxims are rules by which an agent governs him or herself. The problem is, not all rules whereby an agent governs him or herself are in fact maxims. Here they'd be invoking a distinction between general rules and specific rules. A general rule would be something like sometimes to help others. A specific rule would be something like to help Hilly Flitcraft to rebuild his house after it burned down in a fire on April 23rd, 1951. That'd be a really specific rule, a specific intention. The proponent of the standard account might say something like, well, those specific intentions, those aren't genuine maxims. Genuine maxims are general rules. So maybe the problem isn't quite as bad as you're making it out to be. But the reason I don't think that makes contact is that the maxims that I was just talking about were in fact just as general as the maxim sometimes to help others. Sometimes to bake others, that seems to be just as general as the maxim sometimes to help others. And hopefully now the basic issue that I'm trying to point to is becoming clear, namely that the standard account, which I'm confronting here, seems to presuppose something like Leibnizian complete individual concepts. You might call them complete individual maxim sets. The standard account seems to be presupposing that there is out there some sort of list of maxims, infinitely long list of maxims and their contradictory pairs, and each agent has associated with him or her a set of those maxims, an infinitely long set of those maxims, an infinitely big set of those maxims that are associated with him or her, one from each maxim contradictory pair. And again, I think that this is somewhat counterintuitive. Now, the proponent of the standard account might make one last move, might say, well, wait a second, let's just step back a second and use that kind of thought experiment that we used to get on board the idea of maxim contradictories. We'll just use counterfactual reasoning. So you assert that Most agents don't actually have a maxim never to bake others, or never to fillet others, or never to skin others. But now we can just ask a question. Would you ever skin somebody? Would you ever fillet somebody? Would you ever bake somebody? If the answer is no, then you have the maxim never to bake others, or never to skin others, or whatever. If the answer is yes, then you have the maxim sometimes to do these things. And I do think that this counterfactual reasoning is getting at something. It seems to be getting at something about the character of the agent about whom we're asking these questions, but I don't think it's getting at something about which maxims the agent already has adopted. Because remember, maxims are taken to be rules that an agent uses to govern him or herself. And we don't actually need to articulate a fully worked out account of what it means to adopt a maxim, what has to be in place for an agent to adopt a maxim. We just need the rather minimal claim that for an agent to adopt a maxim, it must be the case that she or he has the concepts that are appealed to, that are part of that maxim. And the basic problem that I'm pointing to is that there will be all sorts of maxims on this maxim contradictory pair list that agents simply won't have the concepts to articulate, won't be able to articulate. And if they're not able to articulate them, it follows immediately they don't have them. Whence I would conclude that the notion of, of a maxim contradictory is simply not very well defined. So hopefully I've successfully injected some doubt in some of you that maybe there might be something awry with the standard account. I'm going to put it down now and pick up another account. An account that appeals to maxim contraries and the deliberative field. And hopefully as we go through this account, I'll be able to elicit the intuition that not only does this account work, not only does the standard account work, but in fact, no such account can work. So we're going to go through this section of the talk in the same way that we went through the previous section. I'm going to start with a few quotations. I'm going to explain what I take the argument to be in those quotations in my own words. And then I'm going to try to explain why I think it doesn't work. Oops, too fast there. So we've got the first quotation up here. Questions have been raised about whether the formula of universal law and or the formula of the law of nature, so the universalizability tests, really do yield all our duties. Several commentators, like me, have argued that the universalizability tests give rise only to negative and not positive duties. This objection seems incorrect. If I must reject the maxims of letting all my talents rust or never helping anyone else, then I must accept their logical contraries, namely maxims of cultivating at least some of my talents and helping at least some other people some of the time. Here we have a quotation from Korsgaard, another very prominent Kant scholar, Kantian ethicist. Kant does derive obligatory ends from the formula of universal law, one of the universalizability tests, but he does it by a curiously roundabout procedure in which someone is imagined formulating a maxim of rejecting them and then finding it to be impermissible. This argument does not show that there would be a moral failing if the agent merely unthinkingly neglected rather than rejected these ends. It's an important point. I'm going to come back to it in a second. The point about the pervasiveness of these ends in the moral life is a more complicated one that follows from their adoption by this route. Okay. So again, in the paper at this point, I have a few other quotations, both in the main text and the footnotes. We're just going to work with these two. I'm going to try to explain the argument here in my own words and then explain why I think it doesn't work. So the first thing to notice is that in the first quotation there, not in the second one, but in the first one, there's an appeal to maxim contraries. Not maxim contradictories, but maxim contraries. Different account. Subtle difference, but an important one. So what are maxim contraries? Two predicates are contraries, if but only if nothing instantiates both of them. Okay, so contradictory predicates are contrary predicates, but the reverse doesn't hold. Right? So alive and dead seem to be plausible candidates for contrary predicates. Nothing is both alive and dead at the same time anyway. If we're talking about maxim contraries, we need to narrow our universe of discourse to agents. And we say that two maxims are contraries if and only if no agent has both of them. Okay. So here's an example. Consider the maxim sometimes to tell lying promise and the maxim never to tell lying promise. Those two maxims plausibly seem to be mutually exclusive. Seems like prima facie we could say no agent ever will adopt both of those, so those maxims seem to be maxim contraries. Well, we can't derive positive duties just from this. Right? We can't use the line of argument that we used with maxim contradictories to derive positive duties with maxim contraries. Why not? Because we don't have that crucial premise that all agents adopt at least one of them. So if I'm considering the maxim sometimes to lie, sometimes to tell a lying promise, and the maxim never to tell a lying promise, well, as we saw in the quotation from Korsgaard, I merely unthinkingly could fail to adopt either of these maxims. So we don't get a positive duty just from the fact that these are maxim contraries, and that one is permissible and the other is not. And this is where the concept of the deliberative field enters into the fray. Now, the concept of the deliberative field is supposed to be sort of like an analog to the visual field. It plays a role that the visual field is to vision. It plays that role to deliberation. It's supposed to capture what agents are aware of at some level when they're engaging in deliberation. And the reason why the deliberative field is so key here is that the proponents of this account say something like the following. If I am actually engaged in deliberation about whether to tell a lying promise, I'm actually thinking about it right now, then assuming that my deliberation isn't interrupted in some unexpected fashion, I'm distracted and I just forget about what I was thinking about, assuming that none of that sort of thing happens, then it seems that I must adopt one of these two maxims. And if the maxim never to tell a lying promise is permissible and the maxim sometimes to tell a lying promise is impermissible, then we get a positive duty. So if I'm deliberating about this stuff, then I have a positive duty. If I'm deliberating about whether to help others, then I have a positive duty to adopt the maxim sometimes to help others. If I'm deliberating about whether to cultivate my talents, then I have a positive duty sometimes to adopt the maxim sometimes to cultivate some of my talents. If I'm deliberating about whether to tell a lying promise, I have a positive duty to adopt the maxim never to tell a lying promise. So the positive duties derived in this way are to some extent situation specific. They're hypothetical, they're conditional. They depend on whether an agent ever is engaged in this kind of deliberation. We get a positive duty, a genuine one. The positive duty to to adopt the maxim never to tell a lying promise, but only if I am engaged in deliberation about telling lying promises. There's our positive duty. How do we move out of this just conditional nature of the positive duty? Well, this is the point that Korsgaard was making about the pervasiveness of these ends. It's a contingent fact, but it's nonetheless a fact that none of us is going to be able to go through our lives without at some point thinking about telling a lying promise, about helping others, about cultivating our talents, and so on and so forth. Whence it seems to follow that not only do I have a duty to adopt these maxims if I am engaged in deliberation about these things, but I am at some point in my life going to be engaged in deliberation about these things. So I'm just going to have that positive duty. If I haven't adopted these maxims by the end of my life, I'll have done something wrong. Okay. So now I want to explain why I think that this account actually faces a really big problem. The basic problem that I want to raise for this account is that even if an agent is deliberating about whether to engage in some kind of action, she or he need not adopt either the maxim sometimes to A or the maxim never to A. So let's take this out of the abstraction and talk about telling lying promises. Again, these two maxims do seem to be mutually exclusive, the maxim sometimes to tell a lying promise and the maxim never to tell a lying promise. Doesn't seem like I could adopt both of those at the same time. The problem is that they're not exhaustive. There are plenty of other maxims that I could adopt about lying promises that have absolutely no plausible entailment relationships with these other two maxims and that are permissible. And if that's so, then the one maxim, never to tell a lying promise, isn't obligatory. So here's an example of this. If I'm considering whether to tell a lying promise, well, the proponent of this account says you have to adopt either sometimes to tell a lying promise or never to tell a lying promise, and I say, no, actually, I could adopt the maxim simply not to tell a lying promise now, and remain absolutely agnostic about whether it is in general permissible to tell a lying promise, whether I'm going to tell a lying promise later on in my life. That's a complicated question. Don't want to engage in it. All I know is for right now, the circumstances are such that it would be impermissible for me to tell a lying promise. And you might say, wait a second, doesn't that harken back to the problem we were talking about before about the distinction between general rules and specific rules? Not to tell a lying promise now sounds an awful lot like a really specific intention, a specific rule. So is that really a genuine maxim? Is that really on the table here as a genuine option, permissible maxim that renders the maxim never to tell a lying promise not obligatory? Maybe not. Maybe not. But that's not actually a problem for me. That's a problem that arises simply because by virtue of the fact that I haven't described the deliberative process in much detail. If I'm considering whether to tell a lying promise to a friend to meet up for lunch, then I might adopt the maxim never to tell lying promises to friends. If the maxim never to tell a lying promise is permissible, it follows immediately that if I specify that maxim further, not very much more, but just a little bit, I'm going to get other maxims that are permissible and that don't seem to be so specific that they're going to be ruled out as maxims by virtue of the distinction between general rules and very specific rules. And so the problem, I contend, is that there is always more than one permissible maxim that an agent can adopt in any given instance about any given action. Always. If the maxim never to A is permissible, then there are all sorts of ways in which I could specify that. Get another permissible maxim, doesn't have a plausible entailment relationship with never to A, and it follows immediately that never to A, although certainly perhaps permissible, is not obligatory. Now you might worry here that this is simply an artifact, the example that I've chosen to use, namely this example about lying promises, where it seems that the permissible side, the obligatory side that this account wants to push us toward, is a never maxim rather than a sometimes maxim. You might say, well, is that kind of line of objection really going to work with the duty of beneficence, where the permissible maxim is sometimes to help others, and that's the maxim that the proponents of this account want to say is in fact obligatory? I want to say yes, that it actually does work against that as well. And in fact, the problems are deeper when we're talking about duties like the duty of beneficence. I want to press two lines of attack here. The first line of attack is the same one that I was just going through. If we're talking about sometimes to help others and never to help others, and we're saying sometimes to help others is permissible, never to help others is impermissible, still it's not the case that an agent must adopt one of these two maxims, even if she or he is engaged in deliberation about helping others. If sometimes to help others is permissible, then it seems to follow that there is some specification of that maxim that is permissible, sometimes to help human rights activists, sometimes to help animal rights activists, sometimes to help vegetarians, whatever. And if we've moved away from the notion of maxim contradictories, I don't feel any pressure to say that by virtue of adopting the maxim sometimes to help human rights activists, I am thereby eo ipso committed to the maxim sometimes to help others. But even if you do feel that pressure, it should be noted that there are specifications of the maxim never to help others that are also permissible. Never to help the Nazis perpetrate genocide. never to help the slave catchers catch slaves and bring them back to their owners. Those seem to be permissible specifications of the maxim never to help others. The maxim never to help others is impermissible, but if those maxims are permissible, then it seems like we could specify other permissible maxims that could be adopted about helping that render the maxim sometimes to help others not obligatory. But the deeper problem with the duty of beneficence is something like the following. The maxim never to help others is so capacious that it seems unlikely, unrealistic to me to say that any agent ever has contemplated this maxim outside of a discussion, an abstract discussion of Kant's and or Kantian ethics. And the maxim sometimes to help others seems to me so vacuous that, again, it's unlikely that any agent ever realistically has contemplated adopting this maxim outside of the abstract discussion of Kant's and Kantian ethics. Now, if we're talking about maxim contradictories, that actually doesn't seem to be much of a problem. Maxim contradictories are sort of by necessity something that goes on in the background. So the artificial nature of these maxims doesn't seem that objectionable. The problem that I was pointing to with maxim contradictories is that there's too much going on in the background. But when we've put maxim contradictories down and we're talking about maxim contraries and the deliberative field, then the artificial nature of these maxims ought to raise eyebrows. If we're talking about deliberation, and we're saying that agents have a positive duty to adopt one of these maxims in the deliberative field, and the fact that no agent ever realistically would deliberate about these maxims is a real problem. And I think it's sort of the breaking point of this account. Okay. So now I'm just going to wrap things up. Hopefully, as we went through that account, I was able to elicit perhaps some plausibility, make somewhat plausible the idea that for any given situation, for any given action, there is going to be more than one permissible maxim, and therefore the universalizability tests were our only ethical standards. There are no positive duties, and if that argument holds any weight, the arguments that I've been given hold any weight, then it follows that there are no positive duties that can be derived from the universalizability tests. But last thing I want to say is about another kind of objection that's often raised to the universalizability tests. It dates back to Hegel. Many of you are probably familiar with it. It says the universalizability tests are just empty formalisms. There's no acting from duty if those are our only ethical standards because there are no duties that can be derived from them. Now, there are a lot of historical questions about how, in fact, we should understand Hegel's original criticism of it. Suffice to say that people have lobbed this criticism at the universalizability tests since that time, probably before that time, and that it comes in a lot of different forms. And all I want to say about this is that although I have argued that positive duties cannot be derived from the universalizability tests, I haven't said anything about negative duties. And if negative duties can be derived from the universalizability tests, as I in fact think they can, then that might suffice to do away with this objection about the universalizability tests being an empty formalism. Thank you.